Hello, hello, and, welcome to, history or whatever. And this segment's gonna be called Fuck Around and Find Out. So, when I started looking at doing a podcast, I wanted to do something that was more than just comedy. Because if you don't know me already, I'm James Manning III, and I like history. I'm kind of I like to be smart. I want to be wicked smart. But and I had this bright idea, right? I'm gonna start this podcast, and it'll be a history podcast. And I didn't really think about all that much, how much work that was gonna be. And I stumbled across one of the most important subjects that I never knew anything about. And it stemmed from a conversation that I had with a comic friend of mine who is originally from India. And later on, he sent me an article, and I looked into that, and I realized I had to go way back to figure out where this was coming from. Like, how am I going to accurately portray this story to you in a comedic fashion without fucking it up too much? But I'm calling this Fuck Around and Find Out on history or whatever, because, Jesus, what did I stumble across here? And the greatest thing about living in today's world is the fact that you have access to everything. You have access to everything. Any information you want, somebody has already done a million YouTube videos about it. They've done the synopsis on the books. It's out there. Just go find it. It's wonderful. You can just sit in to keynote speeches that have happened around the world anytime you want. Well, because I found this, I had to start looking into it, because what I found just led me to more questions, What if you had an idea that would revolutionize the business world? Not only the business world, but it would really change the entire world. I mean, what would you do with that? I mean, if you knew that that was how it was going to work out, would you also know, like, that it would make you fabulously wealthy? You probably would if you knew that. But would you understand that your lavish wealth and what you were doing with that idea, that revolutionary idea, was basically the equivalent of unleashing an undefeatable Leviathan upon the world? Would you still do it? I mean, like I said, this started because a comic friend of mine, his name's Abhishek Kulkarni, and he'll probably be on the next episode. This is the first episode of a 2-part series of Fuck Around and Find Out. On the East India Company. And the second part is going to be on the Sepoy Revolt of 1857. Because Abhishek sent me this article about the revolt of 1857. And what I saw there was where the term bite the bullet comes from. But what I saw was that the East India Company was in control at the time in India. They were wearing red coats like the English Army or the British Expeditionary Force or what have you at that time. But they were not the crown. They were a corporation. So, of course, I had to go way back to figure out what was going on there. Yeah, I mean, imagine that. Like, the beginning of English rule wasn't actually the crown, it was a corporation that got its charter from the Queen. Yeah, it's quite an interesting thing to think about, right? That it was actually a corporation. So we'll go back to those questions, you know. What if you knew that you were going to unleash the most devastating uh, idea upon the world? I mean, it's never, the world at that time had never seen it, and actually, ever since then, has been sort of the model for how corporate uh, takeovers, corporate expansion, corporate increasing upon everyone starts at this place in time, because this is the birth of the joint stock corporation. You know, the birth of the joint stock corporation, like, to us these days, that's kind of just like a regular thing. We know about shareholders, and there's tons of, all the companies trade that way. One of the most astonishing things that I came across during this study was so the Lord Chancellor said that corporations have no bodies to punish and no souls to condemn. They therefore do as they please. So when you think about corporations, what comes to mind? I'm going to take this subject here that's horrible. I mean, a lot of times when you look into history, what you find is like deplorable. You can't even believe that was going on. But that was human history, man. We just love to murder each other. And once, for whatever reason, and people who figure out, oh, you can just do that and be, maybe you understand that you're evil as fuck, but most of the time those people don't give a shit. So what comes to mind? Is it the ability to avoid paying taxes? Or maybe, just how the profits for the shareholders are all they care about? Ruthless corporate takeovers? People, fictitious legal persons, perhaps? A complete and utter ruthless disregard for people in the law? I don't know. These things usually come with corporations. Maybe you think big TVs or, I don't know. You can't really build big things without some sort of corporate entity. But for the most part, they're very destructive, and, they become a leviathan, like I said, like a creature that's so large that you can't, even governments don't rival the size and power of these mega corporations. Maybe you think of strip mining or asset stripping, because you have so much access to money that you can pretty much, get your way one way or another if you're playing by the rules. However, if you write your own rules, it's pretty easy to continue to do exactly whatever you're doing, right? And you just write them for yourself and make everybody else obey them. Well, in the 1600s, India was an incredibly wealthy place under the Mughal rule. But, and it was all due to like textiles and spices. It was just an incredibly wealthy place due to its trade under the Mughal Empire, holding like 40% of the world's GDP at that point. But sometime around 1770, India was so impoverished. Like, the corporation had stripped away so much that the corporation itself was having money problems and having to go back to the English bankers to ask for money. And what happened was that there was a famine that came along. Those are kind of something that happen naturally in human history. Once in a while, the food crops go bad and there's a bad famine, right? Well, that's the deal. Is like this famine came along and they had stripped so much away from India, and since the East India Company was a company, not a government, they had no reason to look after any sort of welfare of the people. They don't care about the people. They're a corporation. What do we care? We don't need these people to be like, fine. We just keep taxing them. And even at that point, the shareholders of the East India Company, somewhere around that same time period, they had voted to give themselves a pay raise, a shareholder pay raise, or whatever. They up their shares. You hear what I'm saying, okay? I'm a comedian, all right? Give me a freaking break. But it was like a 12% increase in their profits to the shareholders, as there's like a major famine going on, that millions of people are dying in India, where they're getting all their wealth from. This is the kind of thing that I think about, because it's absolutely infuriating to me how this happened. I mean, this is the first time that you have a corporation running out of a small office. I say like there's like 35 people in London basically running the entire like that whole stretch of India. They were ruling, and it wasn't anything unusual to these folks. They were just like, yeah, we're getting incredibly wealthy. We're raking it in. But they didn't see, and often the East India Company didn't tell them what was going on. Because one of the reasons they think that they were having such trouble with the East India Company was that the people who were involved in the trading were trading illegally. And of course, I mean, corruption is the other thing you think of when it comes to corporations, right? The corruption had, just because they have so much money, they started getting involved in politics. Yeah. This is the most incredibly relevant story in the past that I could hope to come up with, and I knew nothing about it. And all it took was a little bit of a talk and something I've never heard of before, and it led me to the greatest discovery of corporate entities that this planet has ever seen. So this is how it's going to work, right? This is the story of the East India Company. And I'm just going to float through it. Hopefully I can paint the story for you, but I want to stop every once in a while and remind people that I love history, but I'm not a historian, and you're not going to get a historian's view. You're going to get a pot-smoking comedian's point of view, who's basically done mostly construction work in his life, although I have written a paper too, okay? But, I'm going to try to be accurate with this as much as possible. And if there's anybody out there that listens to this and they want us to dispute something I'm talking about, hey, we'll make that available for you, okay? I don't have an email where you can bitch at me yet, but I'll make one up, okay? Don't you worry. I'll give you a chance to bitch at me later. But for now, I want to just get started here, okay? This is history and whatever. And we're going to do history. We are going to do whatever. Trust me. And this segment, of course, is going to make you all full of smart. It's going to make every one of you full of smart. I'm going to smarten you up. I'm going to inject some smart right into your head. In in the only dumb fashion that I can do it. Well, we're having fun at least, right? All right, let's get into it. Like I said before, I didn't know how much work this is going to be. I've scribbled so many notes, and you kind of just have to go back pretty far to where it starts with the East India Company. So the English are landing in 1608 in India with a charter that they were given by Queen Elizabeth I around about 1600. And they land in a place called Surat, which is on the sort of northeastern side up there, sort of facing towards England, you know. But they're not the only ones there. There's the Portuguese, I believe, were the first to get there. And then you have, the Dutch and the Danish and the French coming later. And, hey, what are they looking for? Why are they there? What does this company want? They want cotton and silk and spices like pepper and cardamom and cinnamon and clove. These are all very sought after things, And this is kind of just a thing that's fine for a while. Under the Mughal Empire, they just do trade for a long time. But the problem is all these different entities, the English, the French, the Dutch, they're building fortifications, shipyards, walls, and a lot of times the corporate answer, of course, because these are all basically companies. I believe the Dutch East India Company certainly was. But anyway, of course, what do you do with competition? Well, you just go fuck them up, go sink their ships and shit. Hey, these guys are being a pain in my ass, and for the crown, we need to go fuck them up. That's kind of how it is. But I mean, imagine this, like, you're just like there, and you allow these dudes to come in and trade because it's like, hey, that's making us all wealthy. So yeah, I'm for that. And the deal is they just start fighting and building fortifications and burning shit down, and your trade sometimes doesn't work because you're trading with all of them. This is not good. This is, your people and you are really the ones suffering. The companies are there from other places, so they have their losses, but they're limited. You might be in the middle and your house is destroyed or things are set on fire and you lose everything and now you're destitute. So, of course, this wasn't really a very good arrangement for everyone for, about 100 years. 1600, 1700. They kind of fight each other and do their trade as they will. Continuing to build more fortifications, walls, all that. Well, of course, what happens with fighting when you're in a nation, right? Well, you have to get involved in politics at some point. So it looks, from what I could find, the East India Company sort of started to try to get involved in politics around 1651. And how do they do this? They start developing even more infrastructure. There's already 1 million looms in India, right? That's why they're there, textiles. But they need places to store their things, like warehouses, before they take them to their shipping yards. They were running their own shipping yards. I mean, this is getting larger and larger. And their trading posts that they're making were all becoming more fortified, and they were fighting the whole time with the Dutch and the Portuguese. Well, under this time, there was Mughal rule, and the Mughal emperor, his name was Aurangzeb. Now, I went to public school, so you'll have to forgive me on the pronouncing on that. I believe it's Aurangzeb. But what they did is the East India Company went to Aurangzeb, and they wanted him, they convinced him to issue a farman, So basically, a firman is like an edict. And what they wanted that edict to say was that the East India Company could trade without paying taxes. Well, this, of course, led to a loss of revenue for Bengal, and that this is kind of where it starts, where the asset stripping of India starts. Very much so, because when this firman was issued, there was already a lot of corruption going on. So like Bengal was already losing money due to the illegal trade that was happening because of the corruption. So they weren't even collecting that much taxes anymore. Now they've got this firman that says, "Hey, you can't collect taxes. They don't have to pay the duties on this trade like everyone else." So that's easy. That really immediately ups their ability, right? That frees up some liquid cash. But in 1707, Aurangzeb dies. And because he was the Mughal emperor, everyone else because India is so large, there were a bunch of these local rulers who wanted to be kings of their own kingdoms. So it wasn't as united anymore, like just in an instant. And as soon as Aurangzeb dies, they're broken up a bit more. Completely, just divided amongst the territories, as no one could really take over. This goes on for until the firman was issued, so they're still just trading duty free, and this goes on until like 1754, 1757. You got these new way of ruling. You have these Nawabs who come in and are kind of ruling these segmented places and dealing with the East India Company. So you have a new ruler who's dealing with these people who aren't paying taxes, who are illegally trading by the use of corrupt officials. They're bribing people. They're doing whatever they want. And they're just stripping Bengal dry. They're just taking everything. And these rulers try to stand up to them and tell them, hey, you guys got to start paying taxes. You got to quit disrespecting us. You're writing these disrespectful letters to the government. You're expanding all of your fortifications. You guys are you're doing too much here. And of course, the East India Company just were like, give them the banger. You know how the English are. It's like, oh no, dear boy, have got it all wrong. How could we possibly work here if we had to pay taxes? No. That would be just those demands of the Bengal government are unjust, and, we're just not going to deal with that. Why pay taxes? What are you talking about? And the letters, I guess they don't give a shit. This is English stuff. This is how they've always done. Oh, dear boy, terribly sorry about not paying my taxes, chap, but you'll have to just shove it, prick. I'm sure that that's a very accurate depiction of these, corporate dogs. But, hey, what are you going to do? I guess back then, and due to this disagreement, of course, led to the Nawab being sick of the English's bullshit and wanted him to stop interfering in politics of the region. Quit building more fortifications at Fort William and pay your damn taxes. Well, of course, the English response didn't thrill him, so off he went and took some forces and captured Fort William with 30,000 troops and took a bunch of English prisoners. Well, this led to what is called the Battle of Plessy. Plessy? Yeah. Once again, I went to public school, people. Give me a break. But it happened in 1757. And the Nawab who is leading the revolt and had Fort William was betrayed by this guy. I guess his name was Mir Jafar. I'm kind of just avoiding some of these names because I'm not going to be able to pronounce them right, and I feel that that's a little disrespectful. But in some cases, we have to let it go. But basically, this guy was convinced by a man named Robert Clive to lead his forces away from battle at the crucial moment. So the Nawab at the time, was betrayed by Mir Jafar, so he became the new Nawab. And that guy escaped on a camel, but later was found and, yeah, they put him to the sword, of course. And in 1757, Robert Clive, after taking Fort William back, with, of course, Robert Clive is agent of the East India Company, and the East India Company has their own army, which includes cannons and men, the sepoy. So the sepoys are actually like 80 to 95% Hindu and Muslim. They're people from the region who are in these armies controlled by a handful of English officers who aren't the crown, by the way. And there are some crown among them, and that it's kind of weird how that works. It's very odd seeing that there are some like English soldiers mixed in there, but the English soldiers who are part of the crown army are outranked by even the highest rank in the EIC. So it's just very interesting how that works. I don't know why they'd have anyway. But this is a turning point at the time, because now they've retaken Fort William, and one of the people who was captured in that fort ended up being a pretty crucial player later, William Hastings. Warren Hastings, excuse me. But this is just kind of an example of what continues to happen. Like, the East India Company is able to do this because they have European weapons and like a few very simplistic but technological changes that make the difference. Just having an idea, an innovation, like you have one row of musketeers, the sepoys, on knee, fire, and you have the next row behind them, fire, and then you switch out. You know, these are just things that people hadn't learned yet in warfare, so the Mughals were just at a disadvantage because they were behind in the technology that the Europeans had. And a lot of these other factions, like during this time, there are factions fighting all over India. There are several different factions. I mean, not only do you have the different English factions, but you have people that are up in Afghanistan, the Matharas. See, I keep mispronouncing this stuff, and it makes me sick that I feel like I'm mispronouncing it, because I'm sure I am, because this is kind of just stuff that I'm not used to pronouncing. But, I mean, you have, that's up north of India, and then down south you have another sect that has control over that region, and they're fighting with the English. So there's just a lot of fighting going on at this time in India amongst all the different groups that want to trade there. But the English have an edge now because they have Mir Jafar, who was called the Puppet Nawab. So with this guy's help, it's a little easier to rule the place. And Robert Clive leaves India in 1760 for the first time after leading that successfully, So he's there and he's out. And then the next major thing that happens is another battle, which would be 1764 and the Battle of Buxar. So the Battle of Buxar is basically the second biggest turning point for India, because you have Mir Jafar, who dies in 1765, and Robert Clive returns and becomes governor of Bengal again. Well, because they've pretty much taken over the whole structure, they just continue to take more and more. And the East India Company army is like 200,000 strong, which makes it one of the pretty much the largest army in India. Not only that, it outnumbers the English army. You know, the guys are sort of mixed in by about 100,000 men. So imagine like your favorite megacorp. You know, what is it? Freaking Walmart or Google or dumb stuff. I mean, you know what I'm saying here. Look, any of those huge corporate entities with guns and armor and 200,000 men at their disposal. That's a pretty intimidating thing. You know, and Robert Clive, after seeing what's going on here, he just writes a letter back to the East India Company in London and says, you know, hey, we must become Nawabs ourselves. So no more of this puppet stuff. He wants to take over the whole government. And he kind of just starts making a new one. He calls it the dual system of government. Well, under this new system, dual system of government, there was no justice system created. So I imagine that the East India Company was probably in charge of just dealing with it, maybe hanging people for whatever reason, or whoever else just dealing with things as they come up. It must be hard to operate without a justice system, right? But this Robert Clive guy, this is kind of what it was, this new dual system of government. There was like a new thing installed at this time under the dual governmental system, which means that from what I can gather, it just means that the East India Company has control of defense, and then you guys get everything else. Like, we don't want to handle your domestic problems. Okay, you deal with that. But we're going to be over here like the mafia, kicking your ass if you don't deal with us, you know, if you don't do what we say. And that's kind of how it was, you know. It was like, you guys have so much, but we really ultimately have the power here. And when Robert Clive comes back and defeats the current Bengal Nawab, there's a very famous picture that they always used to show that's like not accurate at all, which is funny to me. It's just something that someone depicted that makes it look like, hey, you know, the Nawab of Bengal was just sort of handing over a document, you know, hey, all right, we're all good here. No, he was absolutely defeated because he was just completely outmanned and outgunned militarily. And he had to grant the East India Company the Diwani of Bengal. Didn't have a choice in this. And what this means, as Diwani, this just allows you to collect taxes from the people. Do you get it now? Do you get it now? Not only do they trade duty-free, so they don't have to pay anything into the system, now they've won a battle and take over the territory and say to the person who's in charge, you give us the ability to collect taxes of your people now. And he has no choice. He just got his ass kicked, right? This is the beginning of the all-out looting of India. And I'm not over-dramatizing that whatsoever. Think about the process here. If you're levying taxes, right, to buy goods from the place where you're levying the taxes, You have paid nothing for those goods. Not only that, when you go to export them back to India, you have no tariffs on exporting. What are you doing for the local government? What are you doing for the local people? Absolutely nothing. You are siphoning off the wealth into your own tank, 1,000 miles away or something like that. I don't know how far they were. I don't know how far Bengal is from England, but it's a long fucking way. It takes a long journey aboard ship to get there. And that's where most of the treasures from the Mughal Empire are actually in England. In fact, there are more Mughal treasures and artifacts in a small country castle in Wales, not in the rural Wales, that has like more than the National Museum does in India. And I'm not sure if I wanted to say it's in Bengal, but I'm not exactly sure where their museums are, but that's the kind of wealth stripping that we're talking about here. That they've just taken so much, and they were so wealthy they could just buy whatever, that they actually had stripped India of its own national heritage in a way, taking away more of their goods and the things that nation has created, and they still reside in England. It's not like any of those folks wanted to give it back. I mean, sure, some of them probably did. Some of the things that they just, stole away from India. Yeah, they're of national importance, some of these pieces. And one of the things that I came across, too, was this guy, Robert Clive. So Clive was a pretty, gangsta. He was like an OG. This guy was doing a lot of stuff on the side. Because from what I could find, Robert Clive left India for the second time in 1767. And by then, he was worth some 400,100 pounds. That think about this. We're talking about 1767 here. 1767, this guy's got 401,000. Well, the English government noticed this. The Crown started figuring out that this company has become so freaking wealthy that they are able to do some things that they're not even comfortable with, like bribing politicians. And they start finding out about all this kind of illegal trading that they're doing. So, I said 1767, old Rob Clive was back to jolly old England with a great big fortune at his disposal. However, 1772, he's charged with corruption, and, he's acquitted, but he kills himself. He's a little guilty, even if he's acquitted of his crime of corruption, and he still kills himself. He's like, I was pretty corrupt. I'm not going to argue that. I think I'm over this. I feel bad. All right, back to India. We're going to talk a little bit about Clive. Well, at this point, they have been so successful that they've basically conquered the most of India. Most of India. It's not completely in their control yet. But they've created these 3 presidencies in Bombay, Madras, and Bengal. And those are kind of like the 3 edges of that country. And they're in control there. And you have the dude Warren Hastings, who was originally in that fort that was captured. He's now made Governor General, which he resides in Bengal, I believe. And that was in 1773. So right after, a year after Robert Clive kills himself for being a bastard, uh, you have this guy Warren Hastings come in, and one thing he sees is going wrong, is that dual system of government thing we're talking about. Because from 1765 to 1772, under the dual system of government, and Robert Clive basically being in control, there was no justice system whatsoever. So they just had like tax collectors rolling around, and if you didn't pay your taxes, they just hung you, whatever. But things are coming because of this corruption that has been seen, and it's changing because, like I talked about earlier, the 1770, you have like a massive famine and millions die, and the company does nothing. Apparently, there are some people who go and deal and like do some soup kitchen kind of thing and help people out, but that's like individual people. Governments, when they take over a place, they have to care for the people. They'll keep grains, silos, and things specifically for these occasions where they need to feed people, but they don't. East India Company doesn't need to do any of that. They don't give a flying fuck. They have no reason to. They only care about profits. And what happens is, in 1773, this is kind of the scenario where you end up with the Regulatory Act of 1773. So this was established to rein in the East India Company, because prior to that, during this time, they had started losing so much money, and there's such a huge enterprise that goes quick. You start losing money, you're losing money hand over fist. And they go back to the bankers and they try to get the bankers to bail them out, and they give them some money, and then they need more, and they're like, we don't have it. This is a major problem. And they really are too big to fail. And that's an interesting thing, too. As I came up with this, there's a guy, he wrote a book called The Anarchy on this subject. And his name is William Darley-Wimple. And he's an amazing speaker. He's lived his whole life from 18 till current day in India. I really enjoyed watching this guy's speeches about this subject, because he took the time to point out how this is so relevant to us. I mean, think about the things that we're dealing with, corporations. This is the English crown having a hard time trying to deal with the Leviathan that's gone mad and gotten hungry and is starting to consume other things, and it's leaking out into different parts like politics. I mean, the officials for the East India Company are so rich, hey, buying off some officials ain't that big a deal. I mean, if only one guy's got 400,000, I mean, think of all the different enterprises that happened and all the money that was made that was never made to the books, right? Well, during that time, when the Regulatory Act of 1773 was made, this created the Supreme Court in India. So now you do have some sort of justice system, but really all this is kind of a different sort of overt control, because they kind of leave some of this stuff to the Bengali, or in the other regions of Madras, whatever. They kind of left it up to them to do a lot of their governing, and then it would just go up in the courts and really gave all the power to the freaking white English people who were there. So they just sort of installed these different types of rulings so that they could just continue to expand their territories. And this is what happened. They went on, and they fought just war after war, like 4 wars against the Mysore people. There was another 3 wars fought against the Mathura, which those were, and I know I'm mispronouncing that, which they were the northern ones from kind of in the Afghani region up there. But these were major battles. We're talking about not battles, these were wars. The Anglo-Maratha War, the Anglo-Mysore Wars. Okay, the East India Company is full on fighting wars for control of the region because they're covering the taxes, they're collecting them, they're also covering pretty much the trade that happens in and out. And now they're fighting wars against the different factions that rule different parts of India, not to mention just always fighting with the other, the Dutch and the Danish and the Portuguese. They're just fighting all over the place. But through this sort of overt control through the political system, controlling the trade, controlling who is even in the region and has any power, period, not just trading with them, but making sure to eliminate them. And this is just how it goes. The asset stripping of India continues, and they just fight more and more wars, done with troops, mostly from India. Just because they have so much power, they're able to do this. And, in 1818, they have control of India. They basically have control over most of India. I mean, go look at a map. Go look how big that place is. And how are they able to do it? Because the immense money they've been able to generate as a corporation exploiting the people of India. And it's worth to point out that a lot of the money that was being used to fight these wars and to employ the sepoys, this is being done, financed by Bengali banks, the people in the region. Because why? Well, the English know how to deal with loans, and they conduct themselves in that way. So when they get a loan from the bank, they repay it on time with interest. So those banks are fine. They don't have any problem with it. This is another reason why it was just sort of an overt thing where they just move in step by step. And it happens over a huge period of time. A huge period of time. And there's so much to this story that I can't even get it all in. And, the Battle of Buxar was 1764. And we started this story in 1600. All right, so far I've gone over like a really poor version of what happened there. Okay, I know it's really bad and I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but I'm just trying to get at the main points of this story. Like, what's important about this? Well, there's also some side things happening that the East India Company is responsible for. So we talked about, 1770, the famine that was happening, but by 1773, almost all of India had been stripped. They were just taking everything. I mean, you're levying taxes to buy your trade goods. They're just taking everything. But they're broke now and they're bailed out. But it's because they actually have done some things in England, like 3/4 of all of the loading docks are East India Company docks in England. Most of them. They've also, something like, the estimate is 40% of the politicians in England at that time were on the payroll of the East India Company. 40%. So look at the beginning of how our company works. And if you get a chance, go Google East India Company flag. Yeah, Americans will notice something right away. You know, the whole thing about corporate bailouts is very relevant to us, and we need to keep an eye on this thing. Because this isn't new. I mean, they're acting like, oh, this never happened before, blah, blah, blah. No, this is just how it goes with the joint stock corporation. Just because money is so large, right? It's inevitably going to be corrupt. And, of course, if you have money, you start getting involved in politics on both sides. So they're not only pretty much running the government in India, but they are almost running the government in England. And I think that it's really important to talk about the other things that the East India Company was doing. All right, if running a corporate army and raising taxes and hanging people who can't afford to pay taxes because you're literally taking everything from them and not giving anything back to the system, that shit's evil. Well, check this out. This East India Company is doing things all around the world. And one thing that they've done is they have sacked Shanghai, taken it from China, and used Shanghai as a place to store and transfer goods so that they could basically forcibly trade with China. They just make China do this stuff. A lot of this stuff is completely illegal too. So the government doesn't want anything to do about it, but the trade is happening anyway, just like it happens in India illegally. So they get this really bright idea. And what the East India Company starts doing is they grow opium, harvest and process it in India, and they started selling the opium to China. And this, of course, caused a problem in China, and they started fighting wars, maritime battles. The Chinese and the East India Company were fighting. And they had this cyclical thing going on as the world's new drug lords, that since they were bringing opium to China, well, what do English people love? Tea, right? So they were selling the opium and buying tea, shipping the tea back to England and America, right? Not only that, what do you need for tea? Sugar, right? You want a sugar in your tea, one lump or two, love. That leads to the Caribbean sugar plantations and the slavery that goes on there to produce the sugar that the world wants, specifically English in America. And the interesting thing is about the East India Company is that it starts to play a role in American history. Because, of course, the Boston Tea Party, where I believe it was 90,000 tons or something, I may be wrong about that number, of tea were dumped into Boston Harbor. Well, that was East India Company tea. They were upset about the taxes and tariffs that the English were putting on them. But you know what? The East India Company was very dangerous, very powerful, and had an extremely large army, and it was making Americans nervous. I mean, this is all kind of happening in the same time frame here. And it's really worth talking about. I wanted to focus on India because history is too great to try to pull together a subject this large, especially if you're such a fucking idiot like I am. Like, I'm not a classically trained historian. I don't know what I'm doing here, but I do like the story. I mean, the interconnectivity of our world becoming global has been going on since this time. And I'm kind of getting to the end of where I want to be today with this podcast, because I've gone over a lot of the main points, and the next thing we're going to talk about, because it's really another one of those turning points in this story. They've fought off the Mysore's by 1799. And they fought the Marathas till like 1818. And they've basically just become a supreme power and in total control of India. And there's another part that happens politically so that they can continue their control and takeover of India, which is called the Doctrine of Lapse. So the Doctrine of Lapse basically says that when you, as a ruler, like a Nawab or what have you, when you die, you can't pass it on to the next person. The English take it. Because they're cool like that. You know, they just show up and they just fucking tell you how it's going to be. This kind of attitude towards the rulers, a major upset. And that's kind of where I have to leave it today. Because when I was looking at this, you can't just go from 1600 to 1857 and go over it there. Because there's so much more that I couldn't get in here. But I'm trying to give you the dumbass, lame James Manning III version of a very important story that has happened in the world, and it's continuing to happen. But I wanted to bring this climax to you in the next episode so that I can have a little more insight of what's going on and give the turning point in India's history the respect it deserves, because the next thing that this leads to the end of the East India Company. We've gone over the beginning and gave you a little bit of backstory of kind of how they were able to come in and take over piece by piece over a couple hundred years, roughly. Give or take, 50 years or whatever, however you want to go out of it. And how it's done. And I mean, how it's still being done all over the world. But this particular event, I think, will be more fun when we go over it together. And we're going to come together, going to have a little meeting of the minds and kind of go over, like, what happened, what our favorite points were, how could this come about. There's a few characters in there, and I can't wait to do this next episode. For now, though, I think I'm going to call it a wrap. This is the first episode of History of Whatevea, presented by James Manning III Entertainment. That means me, my dumb ass. And we hope that you check out the next installment of the East India Company, which will be the Great Revolt of 1857. So, hey, thanks, everybody. Hey, like and subscribe, motherfuckers. Do what you're going to do. But give me a break, if you got a couple of bucks for me. I'm sure you'll find a way to do that as I get things set up. I'm probably just going to put it out there and then sort of in upcoming episodes give you a little bit more information as we go. But I'm looking forward to this. I've had a great time, and I hope you enjoyed it. And join us on the next exciting edition of History and Whatevea. Fuck around and find out. All right, we'll see you later. Hey, well, you made it to the end, and I said I'd have a email for you, and you can email me at jm3e.pod@gmail.com. So that's James Manning III Entertainment .pod. And if you did want to brighten my day, you could always drop me $1 or $2 on Venmo at James-Manning-541. I got to put that in there. And, hey, thanks for making it to the end, you guys. Have a good day.